young woman from the wrong place, how do you become a blessing? If you're a young woman from the West Bank, how do you become a blessing? If you're an artist, how do you become a blessing? If you are a shirt worn with age, worn by too many generations, with one too many holes, how do you become a blessing? So if you're a woman from the wrong place, how do you become a blessing? So you've heard this story over and over again, and it feels familiar, and it feels worn, and it feels different once you start studying the text. Once you get into what was the culture and time and place like into which Mary was born. So in our Bible, if you were to open it up, there is a big gap between where it ends, the Old Testament, and where it begins in the New Testament. There's about 400 years missing, unless you have a Catholic Bible. And in that in-between time in the Catholic Bible, it has some amazing scripture. There is this version of Daniel that has the best creation poem. It has the story of Susanna and the dragon, where Daniel saves the day by riding in on a dragon. And it has the story of the Maccabees. And the story of Judith. And if you don't know Judith, she's the best story of a woman in the Bible. Her husband dies, she's a widow, she's beautiful, everybody wants to take her, and she chops off the head of the king and saves the people. But we took that one out, right? A powerful woman. But I want to talk to you about the Maccabees for a minute to tell you where Mary got the place that she was. The Maccabees are that story of in-between missing from our Bible, the silence. But that silence was full. That silence was full of a people that had waves of rolling oppression. They had the Egyptians come through, they had the Greeks come through, and during the time of the Maccabees, they had, and I'll get this wrong, the Seleucids come through. And in this time, each time the temple was destroyed, the people were oppressed, they were taxed, they were killed, they were imprisoned. And when this Seleucid group took power, they went into the temple. They had ignored the temple for most of the sacking and looting. But they went into the temple and took the light of the presence. They came into the temple and took the candle of Christ, would be our way of saying it. And the priest from the hill country decided that that was the last straw. And him and his sons fled into the wilderness, and they started fomenting revolution against all the invaders. They would challenge their ability to be. They would be guerrillas. Their warfare was precise and targeted, and they challenged every step of the way what was happening under the oppressive regimes. Into that time period, the people where Mary is from in Galilee were a people who had those invaders coming again and again, had the rebels fighting again and again. They were a people who practiced the Jewish faith not the right way. And because they didn't practice it the way that you were supposed to if you were from the southern kingdom, by going to the temple and worshiping, the other Jews looked down upon him. Into that place, into that moment, the people from the northern kingdom suffered all sorts of untold trauma. Into that moment comes the story of Mary. Into that moment comes the story of Mary. I want you to think about this. This is a young girl. We don't know how young is young and how old is how old. We know that Mary was a young woman. And we know that she was in this area of trauma. In this area where most of the men abused and used the women, especially the soldiers of the invading armies. We don't know if that was what happened to Mary, and that is how she got pregnant. What we do know is that Mary has an encounter with God. The first words out of the angel's mouth are, "You are the favored one. You are the blessed one." And she doesn't believe it. Because think about where she is. She is from the Jews who aren't good enough. She's from the part of the kingdom that isn't good enough. She's from the place of rebellion and resistance. She's from the people who are traumatized. Into that space, the angel comes and says, "You are blessed." Where was the angel supposed to go to find the Messiah? To Bethlehem, right? To the southern kingdom. To the place where the hope was to come of David's line. To the place where they practiced the faith right. And yet the angel appeared to Mary and said, "You are blessed. You are favored." And she's like, "Yeah, you got this wrong. That can't be true." Listing all the things that she thinks are wrong with her. Probably in her mind thinking about how she doesn't fit the image of someone that God would send a messenger to. Because all the stories she has read in her scriptures have God always coming to the men. Always telling them that they have a job to do. And yet God came to a poor, young, in the wrong part of the country, of the wrong ethnicity woman. And said that you are going to be the bearer of the Messiah. You are going to be the one who shows forth what it means to believe that God is real and true. Mary, who is neither wealthy nor powerful, is chosen to bear God's Son. Her story begins with blessedness. The prophet Isaiah describes and declares that we are all claimed by God, a God who calls our name, and we are blessed because we belong to God. It even says in Isaiah that God has written each of our names on the palms of God's hands. And so she is known and blessed and loved, but she didn't believe it at first. But as the angel continues to talk to her and tells her that her cousin, who also should not be pregnant, who is too old, she is bearing a child too. And so when she's given the choice, will she be called and blessed and chosen by God? She says, let it be with me according to your will. She consents to having God bless her. She becomes a blessing in that moment. As Kelley Nikondeha says, the God who goes to unexpected places to the north when all expected to the south, to lowly priests with no son, this God goes to an unlikely girl in an unlikely place, shaped by resistance, maybe even trauma, and God shows favor, demonstrating again and again in infinite reversals that human taboo and stigma don't limit the Spirit of God. If you are a woman, a young woman from the West Bank, how do you become a blessing? In the book that Kelley Nikondeha wrote, that first Advent in Palestine, she tells the story of the first intifada, in which there's a family, the Tamimi family, who live outside of Ramallah. And in this community that is the Tamimi family, there is a spring that waters all the food that they grow. And the Israeli settlers and government came in and took the spring away from this family. And the father of the family decided that every day, him and the entire community would show that the oppressors could not win. And so they would march from their houses, their village, their town, down to that spring to say that we are still here. This is our water. This is our place. Now, that doesn't mean it was always nice and kind, because in the West Bank, they didn't have weapons to fight with. So during the intifada, they would throw stones at the soldiers, sometimes scorpions, sometimes snakes. And there's a daughter of this family, Ahid. And Ahid watched as her cousin was killed by the soldiers. She watched as her mother was arrested by the soldiers. She watched as her brothers was taken into and imprisoned by the soldiers, and in order try to stop it. And the last straw was the day the soldiers came. The day before that, another cousin had been killed, and so she slapped the soldier trying to come in their house once again for a raid, because every day they made that march to the spring. And so at 16 years old, she was arrested by the Israeli police. As the poet Lisa Loden captured the scene, in prison, indicted, your short life already, a smoldering mountain of trauma, loss, injustice, ready to erupt. Your narrow shoulders bear the weight of generations, too heavy for your young flesh. Ahid Tamimi. How does a young woman from the West Bank become a blessing? If you're an artist, how do you become a blessing of God? So the artist we're looking at today, I'm standing in front of it, so I need to move to this side. This is a work of art by Wright Pittman. She was asked by Sojourners to create this art after having read Natalie Wiggs Stevenson's reflection on the Annunciation. It was a reflection she was given that pushed and stretched her beyond the way she had been grown to think about herself. She grew up in a Pentecostal evangelical family where as female, your body was seen as impure and shameful. And reading the story of the Annunciation, she says it started to push her boundaries and limits. She had been working on rediscovering who she was outside of that early faith into a new faith and belief in God. And that writing of Stevenson stretched her beyond her limits. She got past her discomfort and became grateful for the challenge. She says that commentary broke her open and rebuilt it with agency and consent and pleasure. She notes that Mary is affirmed by the angel, "Greetings, favored one," and that Mary exhibits agency. How can this be? And offers consent. "Here I am, let it be with me according to your word." Stevenson's writing introduced a question that Wright Pittman had never considered. What if Mary experienced pleasure? This notion proved incompatible with her own internalized shame and unworthiness, that God would be repelled by anything female, by her very natural human qualities. And so as she attempted to create an image based on the article she was assigned, she found herself in tears. She writes, "What if my fully embodying self included the most human parts of me, are not only acceptable but beloved by the creator of the universe? What if because of my meanness, God couldn't stay away and chose to come near and take on flesh? As I drew, I felt a few steps closer to accepting steadfast, limitless, unconditional love of God that I came to believe in, but had yet to fully receive. What resulted was an image of Mary and Gabriel in a warm embrace. Mary has a peace to her that is like a wave of relief over her whole being. A kaleidoscope quilt pattern surrounds them, and patterns Mary clothes. If we could open ourselves up to receive the incomprehensible love of God, maybe we would constantly feel wrapped up in a soft, cozy, lovingly stitched together quilt. Favored one, God delights in you, every single bit of you. Never forget, you are a blessing." If you are a shirt or a dress worn with age, with one too many holes, how do you become a blessing? When I was little, and I can't remember why or where or when, I just remember I had it. That I was given one of the quilts that my mom's grandmother had made. A quilt that I loved and wore to death. And my mom still has a couple of quilts, but they are tucked away and nobody's allowed to touch them. But those quilts that her grandmother made were made in the hill countries of Tennessee by an extremely poor family. A family that always skirted the edges of the law. A family that she took the dresses that may have been worn by 4 or 5 cousins and got to the point that it was just rags, and cut out squares and stitched those squares together, giving that piece of worn and broken fabric a new life, a new joy, a new beauty, a new comfort to a great-great-grandchild that she never met. Kayla Craig writes, "The Advent journey unfolds like a well-worn quilt, each patchwork piece lovingly threaded across time and space. And in each thread, we find blessed assurance that with every staked stitch, God has been moving toward us all along. Advent is a season that reminds us what some may see as discarded scraps. The maker of heaven and earth calls beautiful and blessed. Mary, an ordinary girl from an obscure corner of Nazareth, was not cloaked in power or prestige, but was blanketed in belovedness. We often feel compelled to earn our worth in belovedness, but the one who grants each breath affirms our inherited worth. In light of God's infinite love, we are beloved. We can't work our way to receiving God's compassion. It's already there, as present as the twinkling stars in the sky, as near as the clouds of breath on a cold night. You are blessed. You are beloved. You are from the one whom all blessing flows, who sees you and knows you and calls you by name. Amen.